Welcome, everyone. I'm Jim Bittermann of CNN, and I want to thank you all for joining us for another in our series of CECI webinars with opinion leaders. This one, the start of a sub-series dealing with the first 100 days of the new administration in Washington. The CECI, as you know, is the Centre des Études de Communication Internationale, and it depends on you and events just like this one to raise scholarship funds for deserving communication students to attend classes at the American University of Paris. And you should have received a link to make your contributions to their futures. Today's webinar is exceptional in a number of ways. For one thing, we have two very special guests. We're very honored to have joining us historian and author Tim Ryback, who has written several books and Atlantic magazine articles on the rise of Adolf Hitler and German authoritarianism prior to World War II. And Senator Doug Jones, former Democratic senator from Alabama, and perhaps more germane to today's discussion, a former U.S. attorney, that is to say, prosecutor for the Northern District of his home state. In other words, two guests perfectly suited to answer the question of whether America's democracy is in peril. I should just say that Tim is having some internet problems, so we may not be able to see him live visually, but we can hear his audio very well. So he'll be tuning in maybe audio only as we go along here. Just a quick word about logistics. Author and 60 Minutes producer Barry Lando will take over for a conversation with Tim and Doug in just a few seconds. Since this is a webinar, you've been muted and will not be able to interact directly, but you can pose questions by writing them into the chat function on your Zoom screen, so Barry and I can pass them along to our guests. Without further delay, let's hand it over to Barry, Doug, and Tim.
Senator Jones, thanks for joining us today. There's so much chaos, it's hard to know where to begin. But your 8 years experience as a U.S. attorney with the Justice Department gives you, I guess, a unique view on the turmoil going on in at least one part of Donald Trump's administration right now. You said that, quote, "I'm a Department of Justice person, and what I'm seeing happen there all seems like we're going to hell in a handbasket." Really?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the way I see it. And thanks to CECI for allowing me to do this today. I'm really honored to be a part of it for you. Look, since Tim is a historian, I'm not. I'm just a lawyer, just an old country lawyer from Alabama. Let's talk a little bit about history in the department just briefly. In the 1970s with Watergate, we saw an Attorney General of the United States go to prison for corruption. We saw a corrosiveness within the Department of Justice. And to his credit, President Gerald Ford brought in a lawyer and academic in Edward Levy to kind of right that ship and establish a new norm that has been consistent with the department now for 40, 50 years. And that is to establish some parameters where the department becomes an independent agency in the sense that prosecutorial decisions, civil decisions, those kind of things are not made coming directly from the White House. Now, make no mistake, when we talk about independence of the Department of Justice, it's still a political arm of the administration. It should be. I mean, the policies of the president should be policies of the administration, of the Department of Justice. But individual cases should be based on evidence and the rule of law. It should not be based on the whims of the President of the United States. And since the 1970s, that's exactly what we have seen across Democratic and Republican administrations. We can always talk about the weaponization of the department or the FBI. And I got to tell you, folks, as a prosecutor, I've been on that side both ways. As an assistant, as U.S. attorney, then I've defended cases. Every political figure that ever gets under investigation screams politics. It doesn't matter who the administration is. Doesn't matter if it's the same party. They all scream politics. But the fact is, the department has followed the evidence. By and large, now there are always mistakes, but by and large, they follow the evidence. They follow the rule of law. They follow what is on the books. Well, that has been completely upended at this point. It started on the second day of the administration when President Trump pardoned every one of the January 6th insurrectionists. not just those that have committed violence against the police, as he said, as J.D. Vance said, as others said, but in his words, let them all go, using the profanity that he often uses. It doesn't matter. There were misdemeanor convictions all the way up to seditious conspiracy. That sent a horrible message to everyone that the rule of law doesn't matter. It matters more of who you know and who you support. Immediately thereafter, even before the Attorney General was confirmed, they started asking every office, every field office, to provide names of anyone that worked on those January 6 cases. You installed a new U.S. attorney in D.C. that threatened to prosecute the media. Those kind of things, and people started getting fired. Investigators, remember, Pam Bondi, the new Attorney General, said that we're going to investigate the investigators and prosecute the prosecutors. People began to get laid off, getting fired. A couple of lawsuits have now been filed. And then this week, we saw what I'm calling the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and that is the massacre of justice. And that is 7 prosecutors who bravely refused to dismiss the Eric Adams case, sent letters, strong letters, the acting U.S. attorney, a Justice Scalia law clerk, another lead prosecutor who was a Justice John Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh law clerk, refused to go along with dismissing a case that they saw as a very strong case. But yet, what happens? The acting Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Bovee, comes in, files a dismissal. It will have to be heard by the court. But that is sending this, and I want y'all to think about this. You've got Republicans across the United States who all believed that Eric Adams was guilty. I don't know whether he's guilty. I know the evidence seems pretty damning, but that's for a jury to decide. But this administration, all Republicans said, oh gosh, this guy, he is a corrupt New York City mayor. But now what have they done? They seem to have cut a deal for a quid pro quo. Help us with the immigration in New York City. We will set you free. The immigration czar all but said that on Fox News just the other day. We've also seen one that didn't get as much notice is that the Justice Department quietly closed a criminal investigation into Vince McMahon, the husband of the nominee to be the Department of Education secretary. So we're seeing a complete erosion. This is topsy-turvy. Everything that is old is new again. And that is a real problem, I think, for justice in this country. It's a problem where the institutions of our rule of law, the courts, the media, and all are getting challenged. And I think that folks need to look at that very, very closely, what's happening there and in foreign policy. Yes, Elon Musk is dismantling the civil service, but pay careful attention to the Department of Justice, the courts, and the media.
Is this just going on in the Justice Department?
Well, I think the Justice Department is the focus of where you can truly attack your enemies. The enemies list that Nixon had has now come back. They started creating these enemies list with people that worked on the January 6th case, people that worked on the Mar-a-Lago case, the classified documents case. And so I think that, and along with the weakening of the United States through foreign policy, which is another whole issue, is something that I think can really cause that constitutional crisis that folks say we're headed to. I don't know if we are or not. I think it depends a lot on our court system. In 2020, the courts held. Whether they will do that now or not, I don't know. What we're seeing, in my view, is a complete capitulation by Republicans in the Congress to bend to the will of the president, creating an incredibly strong executive, stronger than we have ever seen. And that, I think, it doesn't give a good sign for things. The rest is going to be policy, and I think it's going to directly affect the American people. But in my view, and Tim may have a different view of this, but in my view, the attacks on the Justice Department, the attacks on the courts, the attack on the media is where we really have to pay the most attention.
Tim, I see you've just written an excellent book chronicling the day-to-day events in Germany after Hitler, as he's seized power in 1933, was elected, you say, quote, Donald Trump has fewer restraints on him today in February 2025 than Hitler had on him in February 1933 when he had also just taken over. Really? Can you explain this?
Yeah, but with a qualifier, Barry, as we know, history does not repeat itself. And as a historian, I don't draw straight lines between one historical figure and a figure in contemporary politics. But one does have to say there are some remarkable, sometimes unsettling resonances between Weimar Germany in February 1933 and United States of America in 2025. Specifically, and this comes to the point, Hitler wanted to be dictator on day one. He was appointed chancellor on on January 30th, 1933 at 11:30 in the morning. He held his first cabinet meeting at 5 o'clock that afternoon. And the first thing he said was, I want an enabling law that will give me dictatorial powers for the next 4 years. Now, why did Hitler want this? Because he had spent the last decade in opposition politics, and he knew how you could basically hamstring the legislative process, how you could topple a government. And in the previous 8 months, he had brought down 3 chancellors and 3 governments simply by obstructionist voting in the legislature, in the Reichstag. So Hitler comes into office 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He says, okay, I don't want them to do unto me what I've been doing to people for the last decade. So he says we need an enabling law. Well, in order to have an enabling law, you need a 2/3 vote in the legislative branch. There was a checks and balance system. He was part of the executive branch. There was a judicial branch. There's a legislative branch. He needs a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag. He basically has barely 51%. So he said,
Uh-oh.
Oh, we've lost Tim.
find a way to sort of rejigger the percentages. So the first he told, look, you need.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
no.
think we've lost Tim's
Oh,
audio.
we've lost
have me
Tim
now?
there. Yep, now we got you, Tim.
Okay, great. Okay. Where did we, Hitler's trying to ban the Communist Party, right? Is that where we left off?
You were talking about the enabling law he was after.
Oh, sorry. Okay. What it is, in order to introduce this enabling law, he needs a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag. He only has 51%. What he decides, he says, well, if we ban the Communist Party, that will give us the 2/3 majority. The pushback is there are 6 million communists. They will go on strike. They will collapse the economy. And with it, your government will come down. So you can't do that. So, and I've heard this is, you talk about resonances. Hitler says, well, why don't we just call out the army to suppress any civil unrest? His Minister of Defense says, Mr. Chancellor, the German soldier is trained to fight an external enemy. He said, it is unthinkable that a German soldier could ever be commanded to shoot German citizens on German streets in German cities. So his Minister of Defense tells him that's off the books. So Hitler then says we need new elections. He wants to recalibrate it. So they call for new elections March 5th, and he sets out a very progressive system of trying to disable the parts of the democratic system that he knows are pillars of it.
Yeah, I think we're having a problem again with audio. Doug, let me ask you a question while we're dealing with Tim's audio. What is your, Tim, we're going to ask Doug a question now. What is your view on what is
The
happening now?
voting,
Some
there's a
people,
general election. He doesn't get his two-thirds.
Timothy, we're going to ask Doug a question now. Doug, the views on what is happening in the United States today, they range from a mild constitutional crisis to something more serious, to some people are saying that there's an actual coup d'etat going on in the United States that we are witnessing. Where do you come down?
Well, I try not to put labels right now on what I see happening. I see exactly what Elon Musk is trying to do, and that is a dismantling of the civil service, reorganizing, and frankly, it's a weakening of America across the world. You can put different labels on it, and people will see things in different way. But as what I'm looking at is truly as I said, a dismantling of the civil service, firing people, getting rid of, cutting down without any real thought to the programs, the intentions, what's going on behind the scenes. Look, Barry, I've always believed that government should function for people. And there are so many people in the United States that do not believe that our government really addresses their concerns. I also thought that for a long time that there is waste and fraud and abuse in the system. But the way you handle that is through a systematic review of these programs, not just an arbitrary having a 19-year-old go through and start cutting things and moving things around at the request of Elon Musk. So I think on the one hand, you're going to see people begin to be hurt. Programs are going to be slashed. Research is going to be slashed. Grants are going to not be forthcoming. And there are going to be a lot of people in this country that depend on that, have grown somewhat dependent on that are going to be hurt right now, as opposed to trying to just simply do something strategically. That's on the one hand. The other hand, as I was talking about a minute ago, what I'm seeing is a complete change without respect for the rule of law. I am concerned about where we are in a country where the President of the United States simply tries to bully the media, and that has been happening left and right as the media landscape has changed, and corporate media seems to be becoming more and more subservient to the whims of Donald Trump, where you've got other forms of media that are reaching people that don't tune in to news. And I think the alternative, the other voices are not being heard to set facts straight. Truth is just not the most important commodity, it seems to be these days. And that plays into the hands of someone who is trying to be the strong man that Donald Trump is trying to be at this point. The final thing is, I said a minute ago, I think we're seeing, this is weakening the United States across the globe. You only have to look and see what Pete Hegseth and J.D. Vance said in Europe this past week regarding Ukraine, regarding the right-wing groups that spread misinformation throughout Europe. We're treading in some dangerous waters here, but I don't think that it is necessarily a coup. I don't think we're in a constitutional crisis yet, but we could easily get there if the executive branch of government basically refuses to follow court orders or so bullies judges. Do they never follow the precedent, the rule of law, and just to simply rubber stamp whatever this administration is going to do and to take over all of the functions of government and cede those functions and have Congress and Republicans in Congress basically allow that to happen?
Well, how do you explain the Republicans in Congress who have so far just kind of said nothing, let Trump and his people do whatever they want to do? You were not a Republican yourself, but you were a colleague of these people for 4 years. How do you explain their inability, their unwillingness to act? Have any of them spoken to you privately about it?
No, I haven't spoken to any of my former Republican colleagues. I have just seen, look, I think that with the way we elect our members of Congress and the Senate, And the way we've become so partisan over the last few years, we have so gerrymandered the House of Representatives that it's really difficult for anything but the extremes of both parties to be in any one district. And when that happens, you see only a small percentage or less than a minority percentage of voters in a primary that can control who ends up being the member of Congress. That has an effect when that happens in the state legislatures, the House and the Senate, the members of Congress. It filters up to governors, senators, others, where we see the red states getting redder and blue states getting bluer. And that's just not a good thing. Nobody has to reach out to the other side. And right now, there's just not an awful lot of profiles and courage among Republicans in either the House or the Senate that are willing to put their positions on the line. I don't use the term careers on the line because none of that should have be a career. They're public servants, but no one is willing to put their seat on the line in order to make a stand. We've seen it on occasions in the past. It's getting fewer and fewer. And you fight that a little bit with your loyalty to your party and your loyalty to a party in power. The president is a member of your political party. So there's a real tug going on there, I think. But at the end of the day, if they don't start standing up to certain things that are going on, I think it may be too late. And I worry that the next thing we're going to see after we get through all of these nominations is an effort to change the filibuster rules in the United States Senate. Remember, these nominations, there is no filibuster rule. There is no 60-vote threshold for any executive branch nominee or any member of the judiciary at this point. It's all a 50-vote threshold. If, in fact, legislation is getting jammed up and Democrats start wanting to have a seat at the table, and they have been wanting to have, if they start exercising their prerogative as a minority, I worry that John Thune and others on the Republican Party will insist that they change the rules that Democrats didn't do during the Biden administration. And we'll see more and more of the executive branch then getting his way.
I think you said that Congress has ceded too much power to the president, not just currently under Trump, but that's been a process that's been going on for the last many years with Democrats as well.
Yeah, there's no question about it. Trade is probably trade and foreign policy, but trade in particular is one where Congress, under the Constitution, it is their prerogative. But over the years, they have just simply given most all of that power to the executive branch. There are so many other things. Every year, every 4 years, when we have a change of administration, you see one executive order after another that challenges and either dismantles or starts new programs that really, a lot of which should have been the prerogative of Congress. We have seen the administration to orders, executive orders this year, going far beyond, going into programs that Congress passed, going into agencies that Congress passed. Elon Musk, who is really running this show, and it appears to me, watching the press conference the other day, that this is really, he is basically telling the President of the United States what should be done, and Donald Trump is just a yes man for all of this and has no real control. That's the appearance that this has. And he has said he wants to shut down agencies. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is an example. USAID is a big example. Those are agencies that Congress appropriated, they legislatively created, but yet now they've got these orders that are just essentially saying we're not going to fund them and they will be neutered and effectively out of business. So we'll see where that goes. But Congress needs to step up, in my view, in a bipartisan way. They need to know where the Constitution lies. What I've seen in so much of the nominations is that one side of the aisle has just really rubber stamped as opposed to exercise their constitutional advice and consent. And that's
Yeah, but
really, I think, unfortunate.
what do you see it's going to make that change?
I don't know at this point. What I'm hoping we will see is that Democrats will start, and I think they have started finding their footing. I think during the nomination hearings, Democrats were laying down markers. That's all you could do with a 50 vote threshold. It would have taken 4 Republicans to vote against someone to kill it. 3 would have been a tie, just like in the Hegseth nomination and J.D. Vance breaking the tie. So you really needed 4. They can never find that 4th vote, and I don't think they will find it on any of the others. So I think there's a combination of the members of Congress getting their footing, having these nominations behind them, start talking about the appropriations process. And one of the things that I would love to see, Barry, since Democrats don't have control of the Senate and the House, they can't control hearings. They don't call congressional hearings. They can't subpoena witnesses unless a majority agrees to it. I think the the Democratic senatorial campaign and the CCC, the House arm of this, ought to start raising some money and sending members of Congress out into the states. Let's have some hearings. Let's have some mock hearings. They're not going to be official congressional hearings, but we need to go into these districts. We need to go into these states and let witnesses come and talk about how these cuts, not just to the workforce, but the cuts to grants, the cuts to U.S. aid, all of the things that are going on right now, how that is going to affect people that voted for Donald Trump and the majority of the members of Congress right now in both houses. Go to these places, go to Birmingham, Alabama, and get folks to talk about how the cutting of grants is going to affect the University of Alabama. Go into some of these rural areas and talk about the cuts to Head Start. Go and talk about in military areas and talk about how the cuts to U.S. aid is going to make us less secure around the world. I think Congress has got to get out, and Democrats have got to get out of their damn bubble in Washington, D.C. and go into these states and into these districts, and not just the friendly districts. Go where they think they may not be wanted, to talk to people and listen to people about what's going on, and how those local news, the local media, start carrying some of this, because we're sorely missing local news these days in the United States.
Yeah, but even people have been telling the Democrats to get out and go talk to the country for years, and yet they didn't seem to have done it. The last election proved it.
I agree with that. It's been, I said that I've told folks that I felt like this election was a long time coming, that for the last 40 years or so, Republicans have built an infrastructure and a messaging machine that Democrats haven't really been able to keep with. We've used corporate media and to some extent the platforms of social media to try to get a message out. But there are so many people in this country who don't care about politics. They don't care about the national news. They want local news. They want information of interest to them. And Democrats aren't on those platforms. We're not reaching those people. We can change messages, all we want to, but unless those messages are actually reaching people where they are getting their information, and I use the word information distinct from the news, where they're getting information these days, it's probably not going to do a whole heck of a lot of good.
Yale historian Timothy Snyder wrote a book on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century. And he wrote, lesson number 1, do not obey in advance. It's been suggested today that a lot of people upset about what is happening are doing just that. They're not standing up for specific causes. They're changing their behavior. They're accepting what's going on. They're afraid of attracting attention to themselves. And so they are essentially obeying in advance. Do you see that happening?
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question about it. And you only have to look at the tech, the big tech companies. I mean, in all candor, I don't think MAGA stands for Make America Great anymore. I think it stands for Meta, Apple, Google, and Amazon. And you can throw in Tesla wherever, somewhere else, because that seems to be exactly what happens. Now, look, every time there's a change of administration, every time that there is a change in control of the House or the Senate, people have to make adjustments for their businesses. I get that. People will start to say and do things differently, but they also try to make sure they do the right thing, and that their business interests can be aligned in a little bit of an opposition to the administration without necessarily being antagonistic. I don't see that happening at this point. It just seems to me that people are just rolling over immediately, and as you say, obeying in advance. And hopefully, as we go through and we can get into the spring, that I'm hoping that may change a little bit as the effects of what's happening really start hitting home to the American public and to people on the street. They're going to start hearing more and more, and hopefully that will start to change a little bit. I don't have all the answers, Barry. I wish I did, but I don't have all the answers. We're in a world that I don't think we've seen ever, and trying to figure out basically how to get to the American people, making sure they understand what is happening and that they care about it, not only in their communities, but on the world stage. I think it's going to be a challenge.
This past Wednesday, the White House suggested that it's not the president who would be responsible for a constitutional confrontation. It would be the courts. The White House press secretary chastised the judges blocking the president's agenda, she said. She said, "We believe these judges are acting as judicial activists rather than honest arbiters of the law." She insisted that the real constitutional crisis is taking place within our judicial branch. That seems to be a warning or a threat coming from the White House that they're not going to accept what the courts do.
It sure can be read that way. It seems that way. But this is not the first time something like that has been said, not maybe using the term constitutional crisis. But let's just go back to the 20th century, and you can look at FDR trying to pack the Supreme Court, but and threatening to try to pack the Supreme Court to get his New Deal agenda through. It was being thwarted at every turn by the Supreme Court. So and he complained bitterly about the agenda being thwarted, and so there was this threat to expand the court. Democrats threatened to try to expand the court in the last term. So every time that there are issues where an administration disagrees, there could be, and there has been in the past. In the 50s, the 60s, there were billboards throughout the South that said impeach Earl Warren because of the Brown versus Board of Education decision and what appeared to be a lot of both pro-civil rights in addition pro-civil liberties decisions coming out of the Warren Court. That started to change in the 1970s. In the last 4 years, we have seen Democrats, more progressive Democrats, demanding that we expand the Supreme Court, demanding that there be changes in tenures, do away with lifetime tenure for Supreme Court, all of which was a direct response to court decisions that were being handed down. But at the end of the day, we were following those. And it happened with FDR. It happened in the 50s and 60s. It happened in the Biden administration. What we don't know now is whether or not this administration will, in effect, obey the law, or if they are also using the bully pulpit that Donald Trump has used so effectively to kind of mold the opinions to come their way, and whether or not all of these decisions that are going to come ultimately, probably by both appellate courts and the Supreme Court, will be influenced by the threats that Trump and this administration has made. That is where we will start to see the constitutional crisis. Right now, we seem to have the warning flares going up that this could happen. At the end of the day, I think the people of the United States will not allow that to happen. But I think it remains to be seen.
The people of the United States will not allow that to happen. What are they going to do?
Well, they're going to vote, number one. I think that they're going to make sure that they have their voices heard. That's, I think, that is going to be the next step. And I'm not talking about protest. I'm not talking about things like that. I'm talking about making sure their voices are heard with their members of Congress, with their local officials. Remember, we've got mayors and city councilors. We've got county commissioners out there. All of that is going on with these funding cuts and the civil service dismantling is going to affect people on a very, very local level. And I think it's at the boards of education. We saw what happened during COVID where people were just livid that their schools were being shut down. Well, if there are going to be cuts, if there are going to be things changing, people need to start showing up at those meetings again. They need to start going and being involved in what former Senator Gary Hart has called civic engagement, in getting back on a local level. And I think folks can do that. And then we've got elections coming up in 2 years. We will see what happens in the midterms. Now, candidly, I think we need to be very careful and not put all our eggs in that basket about midterms for a lot of reasons. One is gerrymandering again. And the second is if they start doing it away with the filibuster, we could see voting bills pass Congress that are not the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that are not the Freedom to Vote Act, but that are more restrictive and putting in place on a national level things that some of these states have been putting in place over the last, since after the Citizens United case. And I worry about that too. I worry about Congress all of a sudden deciding that they need to get into the business of making some consistent voting laws across the country and making them very, very restrictive so that states that are more moderate, states and districts that are more moderate, more swing states, more blue states, are going to have real trouble making sure that the people's voices get heard and that those votes get certified.
Can you see eventually people going to the streets, massive protests, violence?
I hope not. I mean, what I worry about every time that there is a mass protest, that there are forces that want to seed that violence, that are not part of the peace movement, that are not doing peaceful protests. There are forces within that want to do the looting, that want to do other things, and it creates a real problem. Look, there's going to be, I think, demonstrations. I think that's inevitable. They could be in the form of just political rallies, but I think there's going to be some of that. But what I really believe and I want to go back to this. I really hope that folks and Democrats in Congress will go out into the country. Don't just have a town hall. Okay, a town hall is great. But by and large, when a member of Congress has a town hall, the only people that show up are supporters. I had that happen in Alabama after I got elected. My staff and a couple of them are on here, I think. I kept telling them, we need to go into place in Alabama that didn't particularly vote for me, rather than just everyone being a pro-Doug Jones town hall. They need to go and have hearings. They need to get the media. They need to get witnesses and let neighbors tell the story about what's happening to their neighbors, not a member of Congress trying to tell you how they're going to change things, how they're going to fix things. Hear the stories, hear what's happening on the ground, and I think that will do more than anything else, any more than demonstrations, more than political rallies. It is your next door neighbor talking about how certain cuts are going to affect them that I think will have the most dramatic effect. And that information will get back to those Republicans in Congress who might hesitate and know they're about to lose enough voters that it could cost them the election.
You think that Trump would go peacefully?
Look, I didn't think he would the last time. I thought he would end up going, which he did. I think it remains to be seen. And we got a long way to go before we get to that point.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back to Jim now. Timothy, apologies to you in southern France without much of an internet connection, but that's life. and we hope to hear from you more in the future. Jim?
Tim, I think you're still with us, right, Tim?
I think I am.
Yep, you certainly are. So
Yep,
let me just
okay.
ask you, let me ask both of you a question about the judiciary. Tim, did Hitler have any judiciary that tried to put him in check when he wanted to do the various things he did? And Doug, the judiciary has ruled against Trump a number of times now already, and there's some indication that they'll just ignore the various rulings. What do you do if that happens? Let's start with Tim because we haven't heard from him for a bit.
Well, actually, that is a key point. Hitler did implement certain ordinances, decrees immediately. The first was with banning certain newspapers he would ban. The newspapers would take the government to court, and the court would rule in their favor, and suddenly 3 days later the newspaper was out again. But he did then start targeting the judiciary specifically and began to erode that repeatedly. It really was one of the final holdouts, but ultimately also collapsed. Jim, if I could just add one thing that Doug had mentioned earlier, jump in
Sure.
on just quickly, and that was you Doug, you were talking about the polarization of society. The one thing the Nazis that Adolf Hitler understood as well as anyone was how democracies function. And he vowed at the very beginning to destroy democracy through democratic process. And what they did was to begin flooding the public space, when this is the famous Joseph Goebbels propaganda person, flooding it with what we now call fake news. They called them fabrications, but they would flood the public space with these completely invented stories, inflammatory stories that were intended to divide communities, that divide families. And the process was to hollow out the center and to polarize public opinion and public parties, because what they understood about democracy is that it functioned on consensus, and you needed space in the center where people could do political horse trading, give and take, and eventually arrive at some consensus where everyone compromised. Well, they realized you hollow out the center and the democratic system will collapse on its own accord. And if they did anything successfully, that was really, I think, the way they brought down democracy in Weimar. And when one talks about comparisons between then and now, I think that is one of this polarization of public opinion, the polarization of political parties, the inability of elected delegates to reach across the aisle to come to any kind of agreement or consensus. But Jim, going back to your question, yes, the courts were the final bastion, but Hitler fairly
Well,
aggressively eroded and overcame those.
you're cutting in and out here, Tim. So I think you're cutting in and out. So let's go over to Doug. Doug, just to repeat my question, what do you think? Do you think that the Trump people will follow the orders of the courts, or will they just ignore them?
Like I think remember that we have three levels of federal courts in this country. We have the district courts where these cases are initially filed. Then any parties can appeal those orders to the courts of appeal, which then ultimately might go to the Supreme Court of the United States. I think there's going to be a reluctance to follow a lot of these orders. There may be a slowness to follow some of these orders. But I think we've got some fairly aggressive parties in this, and they're, like there was a one or two lawsuits I think filed by FBI agents, current FBI agents, and I think that despite what people hear, I think that individual agents of the FBI still have a pretty high standing with the American public, and so I think you will see more cases being filed. The front line is really going to be those courts. And it's going to be interesting. You may get different opinions across the country. There will be some judges I worry about that will not follow the rule of law, that will effectively just give the administration what they want. There will be others that I really have more faith in our judiciary, even a number of the judges that Donald Trump appointed. I'm going to continue to have that faith until I don't. I really believe that ultimately our courts are going to hold. And if there are times when courts are issuing these decrees and the administration is completely ignoring those mandates coming down, and I think that that's when you start to see that members of Congress start to rise up, because every member of Congress, well, let me take that back. There are certain people up there don't give a damn about anything other than their seats. But I think so many have a respect for our constitutional form of government, our checks and balances, and the court system, whether they agree with those decisions or not. That if there is a wholesale ignoring of the court decisions in ways that challenge our constitutional framework, that I think will be a bridge too far for so many people across the country and so many members of Congress. That is going to take some time to play out. And I worry to some extent of what Tim was talking about and the continue to split. And I go back to what I said earlier about what J.D. Vance said in Europe this week, challenging governments to allow these crazy right-wingers, the platforms, the social media platforms like X, like now Meta, that is not going to police any disinformation, any misinformation. And if that continues to rise and create that schism in Europe and of the world like it has in America, there are going to be real problems down the road. Democrats have got to find, and people that are concerned about democracy, let me put it that way, pro-democracy people across the world have got to find these platforms that people will listen to and get this message out that we are treading into some dangerous waters.
You know, Janet Kennedy's got a question here that applies to the courts, and basically she wants to know how much it's costing taxpayers to defend against the various lawsuits that are being brought. I'm not sure you can give us an estimate of that, but is there anything that could legally be done to cut off the flow of taxpayer dollars to the defense funds that Trump can manage to mount against the people that are challenging his rule?
Well, probably not, unfortunately. I mean, Congress ostensibly has the power of the purse, but this administration is to some extent ignoring that. They are trying to, the term is impound funds, either not spend them or not spend them in the way that they were intended. In the first administration, Trump did some, quote, emergency powers to move military appropriations to build a wall and do things on the southern border. I'm not sure he will think he is constrained right now instead of having a blank check. That's the other thing I think folks need to kind of understand with a lot of these lawsuits where employees are filing lawsuits about their firing. I'm not sure that Trump really and the administration really cares. Let them file the lawsuits. Let them get a judgment against them. They will either pay it or not pay it somehow, some way. We've got to do more. We've got to use, I think, the violation of the court orders as a way to get folks in the Congress of the United States to do their job with the checks and balances and other judges. You know, one thing, Jim, that I have found over my 40+ year career in the law is that while judges may disagree with each other on a lot of different things, they are very, very protective of their role in our constitutional society. And I believe that there will be judges out there who may disagree with with another judge who will rule against the Trump administration, but they're going to want to see that judge's order enforced, because otherwise it could be them. So this is going to play out over the next few months and a couple of years, and I don't think anybody can quite predict where it might go.
Jenny Cameron wants to know if there's what would stop the executive from invoking the Insurrection Act? What are the constitutional limits about invoking the Insurrection Act?
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure that there are any real constraints at this point, in the sense that yes, there is a law, there are guidelines. But if Donald Trump wants to invoke the Insurrection Act, he can do it. And then it would be up to folks challenging that'll be directly affected by the Insurrection Act to go to court and try to stop it. And again, get a court order and hope that we don't have Donald Trump saying, or Elon Musk or J.D. Vance saying, what the Chief Justice has issued his order, now let him enforce it. Those are the issues I think that remain to be seen. I worry. I had hoped that we could have made some changes to the Insurrection Act that would have tightened that up over the last few years, but we didn't do it. There didn't seem to be the appetite with that. But I think they can invoke the president has broad authority to invoke the Insurrection Act. It's just a question of whether or not that authority will be interpreted in a way by the courts that he would then follow.
What would that allow him to do, the Insurrection Act?
It would allow him to use the military essentially to enforce civil law. That's the bottom line. Whether it's on the border. Remember, the Insurrection Act has been called on a couple of times, like in Los Angeles. George W. Bush, I think, invoked the Insurrection Act because of the L.A. riots after the Rodney King attack by police officers. So it essentially allows the military to be used to enforce civil law, and at the direction of the president and the Secretary of Defense.
Senator, one of the things that Mark Cuban just suggested this weekend was the idea that the Dems should have some kind of a nightly newscast. Who would be on this newscast or press conference was yet to be determined. He suggested Pete Buttigieg, but the idea being that every day at an appointed hour that they go on in front of the press and bring a rebuttal to whatever's happened that day. That's kind of along the lines of what you're saying about congressmen going out to their districts. What do you think of that idea?
I think it's a great idea. Right now, Jim, we've got Democrats. One of the biggest problems is the many voices. As Will Rogers said, I don't belong to an organized political party. I'm a Democrat. That is part of the problem. Organizing in that way, I think, is going to be very difficult. And then you get egos involved in who's going to speak. I really think that look, I love the idea. I also like the idea of Democrats across the board trying to have the consistent messaging. And it's got to be twofold. The only thing I would add to Mark's comments, it has got to be twofold. It can't be just simply attacking what the Trump administration is doing. There'll be a lot of fodder there to say. But Democrats have got to start giving some alternatives. We've got to start acknowledging some issues that government may not be serving people as well as it could, and pulling back a little bit and offering some programs that I think the American people can latch onto. So that combination, I think, would be a tremendous way to get people. But again, and I go back to what I was saying earlier about where the messages are going. You can't just go on corporate media or even on social media. We've got to figure out a way to make those comments, to do those things on a nightly or every other night basis in a way where people are actually hearing them and they're getting them either on their phones or their computer or their TV or something. That is a huge problem, I think, for Democrats, having that message.
Yeah, I think we in the mainstream media have seen the decline in audiences for the people that are actually watching out there, where they're getting their information, not necessarily the news, as you make the distinction. They're getting their information from all sorts of things that may be completely spurious. Um, uh, Connie Board wants to know how the Eric Adams case, which is the very specific case in New York, which we talked about at the very beginning, how that fits into the bigger realm of things in terms of Trumpian justice. Is it a big deal for the Trump folks, do you think? Will they pursue it? Are the Dems going to pursue it?
Well, I'm hoping that that's the kind of thing that Dems will continue to talk about, because it is very, I think it fits right along with the Trump view of the Department of Justice. Reward your friends and attack your enemies. It has nothing to do with the rule of law. When the word went out from the Department of Justice to dismiss that case, it had nothing to do with the merits of the case, had nothing to do with the law, had everything to do with non-legal or rule of law issues, such as helping the administration enforce immigration and being able to run for re-election. Those are and if folks haven't seen the letter written by the former acting U.S. attorney who resigned this week, is about an 8-page letter, and the separate letter and the lead prosecutor, read those. Those are just tremendous views of the way that the Justice Department should be acting in cases like this. But this Department of Justice seems to be very transactional. Do you help me, we're going to help you. You're my friend, I'll be your friend. But if you are my enemy, I'm coming after you. And I think we see that. And even though Eric Adams, and I don't know whether he was guilty of this or not, as I said, that's for a jury to determine. It is not for me or anyone else to determine. But there was enough evidence, clearly enough evidence, to make that case and to make the call to let a jury determine that. But he said on this Fox and Friends, which is one of the most pathetic things I've ever seen on television, where you had Eric Adams and the immigration czar, Tom Homan, talking about this. And Adams just giggling it up, talking about it, grinning from ear to ear. And Homan, and Adams saying, oh, there was no quid pro quo with any of this. But Homan said, look, if he doesn't live up to his agreement, I'm going to be in his office up his butt to try to do that. That's exactly what he said. He acknowledged that there was a quid pro quo and an agreement. That is completely dismantling the rule of law.
But the fact that these people resigned, which you think is great, and it is, they showed the courage, the prosecutors who were told to lay off Adams. So they've quit. But isn't that exactly what Trump wants? In other words, people like that are out. There's no longer a problem for him.
Yeah, Barry, I think it's a dilemma in that sense. But ultimately, they were going to be let go anyway. I mean, they could either resign, and we see the outpouring that we've seen right now with these, or they could wait and be fired. One way or another, Trump was going to have his way, and they would have to challenge it in court. Quite frankly, I kind of like the way that they did this, because I think they put it in writing. That's the thing about it. You put it all in writing. You lay it all out there so that there is a record of all of this for people from now on to see what's happening. Again, it's putting down markers, and it is the American people like to see those profiles encouraged. They like to see someone standing up for the rule of law. I will guarantee this. I really do believe this. I think that even the most ardent Trump supporters, if they really sat back and thought about this with the Eric Adams case, they would scratch their head and not know what the hell happened, because they are supposed to be law and order individuals. And there is absolutely no rule of law, no justice explanation for dismissing that lawsuit in the way that they did it.
So, Barry, I think we should probably give our guests a break here and wrap this up. But a couple of last minute things here. One from Joyce Lanning, who was wanted to hear more from Tim Ryback, and of course we haven't had him included too much because of his internet connection. But Tim, she wants to know if there's anything you can hear from Tim in writing. Well, in fact, among other things, he's had a number of, I think, 3 or 4 Atlantic articles recently. And also he's got 3 books out there. Is that right, Tim? Are you still with us?
Yes, that's right. But if you read my books, you might as well read the daily news, because everything I wrote in my books about what was happening 80 years ago is taking place before our eyes today.
Yeah.
So it's,
And then
okay.
one last question for you, Doug, from Robert Fry, who says, all this is happening so quickly. What do you think about the speed of these actions coming out of the White House and from the Trump administration without allowing due process to take its course?
Yeah, it has been dizzying. I think that has been part of the problems. Democrats have been criticized for not appropriately responding, and frankly, Jim, I don't think people fully appreciate how little that the minority can do in the Senate and the House other than just complain and urge legal action. But I think everyone was caught by surprise with the absolute speed and intensity of all that was going on and is still going on. But Democrats are finding their footing. I think that they're beginning to find their voices. They're beginning to see, how they can respond appropriately. They are putting down those markers, and I do think that there will be more to come in the coming weeks. But it has been really remarkable to see just how quickly there was a lot of planning. We talk about the chaos, we talk about whatever. There was a considerable amount of planning with this. They knew exactly where they were going and what they wanted to do. And you know what? People tried to explain that to folks back in the summer when they started talking about Project 2025. But yet the ecosphere out there Donald Trump said, I don't know anything about it. And the ecosphere of media just accepted that. And Democrats were not able to have those platforms to really take that to another level, to explain people what this could mean for them on an individual and community basis.
Barry, any last thoughts?
One last question from Janet Kennedy. I can't resist. Aren't we at an unprecedented time where a few gazillionaires have all the power? They have more money than voters could ever fight against. Their money is buying the courts, including SCOTUS, along with elected officials, and they, Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, control the messaging, where they are shoveling heaps of lies on the masses. This all seems impossible to stop. Isn't our democracy already doomed? I don't see how we are going to overcome their vast resources and power.
Tim, are you there? I'm going to let you take a stab at that.
Well, I guess one of the old adages about the Weimar Republic is that it died twice. It was murdered and it committed suicide. We know Hitler was out to kill that constitutional republic, but had in fact the democratic process, had the elected representatives actually stood up to him, they would have prevailed. Had the Weimar Republic given an extra 6 months, the history of the 20th century would have been completely different. So I would say what they realized in Weimar was that they needed to continue to have faith in the democratic process, but also engage in it and be part of it. And at the end of the day, it came back to the elected representatives to sort of provide that final bulwark for democracy.
I agree with that. Look, this is I think somewhat unprecedented time, given the number of folks with extraordinary wealth that seem to be controlling the levers of government. But at the same time, you go back, and I think history may not repeat itself the way that Tim had talked about earlier. but you can learn a lot of lessons, and we learned some lessons from, with folks that were getting extraordinary wealth in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and how people rose up, whether it was Teddy Roosevelt or others that came up to try to do some things. And I am more optimistic than a lot of people. I am very concerned, but I'm still I'm still optimistic that this country has the people in it that will not allow this to happen, that they will push back where they need to push back. Our differences are with regard to the social media and the way people get their information right now. That is going to be a challenge. There is no question about that. And I have tried to avoid, even on this program with Tim, who has an incredible knowledge and history of Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Third Reich, I have often tried to not make the parallels to the extent with Hitler. That is a regime that we should not ever put on a same category as anything that we've seen in this country. There's a really good article today by Nick Kristof in the New York Times, by the way. I would recommend folks taking a look. But there are authoritarian governments. There are things that are going on around the world that I think we can look to for concern, and I think we can learn lessons from those. But at the end of the day, it is going to be up to us. It is going to be up to us to both get messages out, to talk to our friends, talk to our family, talk to our neighbors, talk to our local officials, and make sure that people understand what is happening to them. Don't just listen to the rhetoric. Don't just listen to what people in Washington are saying to you. Feel what they're doing to you. And that is going to be something, I think, that we've got to get our footing on and make that opposition going forward on a very, very consistent basis, and get it into the whatever platforms we can where people are listening to it. But it's got to be personal. We got to make sure that folks do that. It is not going to be an easy road. There is no question about that. It is not going to be an easy road. But we have come down some really rough roads in this country in the past. And I have every confidence that we will get to this rough patch and make it through.
Thank you very much, Doug and Barry and Tim, for a thought-provoking, if somewhat chilling discussion. Thank you all for attending this session. Just as a reminder, we're counting on you to help the CECI's Scholarship Fund by contributing through the link that you got with your invitation. Goodbye for now, until we meet again, and I think it's going to be very soon.